Good morning, everybody. Today we come in our morning devotional series to Psalm 31, which is a lament. You'll remember that of the 150 psalms in the Psalter, 70% of them are actually laments. Some community laments, others mostly individual laments, but that's a lot of lamenting going on. Now, instead of trying to cover all 24 verses in this psalm, I want to simply highlight two key characteristics that are going to be representative of all the different laments, so that as you run into them, as you go through the scriptures, you'll know what to be looking for. Characteristic number one is the language of lament. Let me read this part of the psalm, verses 9 and 10 and 11. I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. My soul is consumed by anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. Now, just stop right there and notice how we've piled up all these terms of, kind of depressing words. That's the language of lament. And then it's sort of punctuated in verse 11 when the psalmist says, because of all my enemies, I am the utter contempt of my neighbors and an object of dread to my closest friends. Now, it's this kind of language that led Martin Luther to make this comment. He said, where do you find more miserable, more wretched, more depressing words than in the Psalms of lamentation? Well, that's true, but it's only part of the story. There's more to a lament than that. In fact, the term lament is not altogether satisfying. It suggests a kind of pessimistic view of life, a morbid orientation of human misery. And the purpose of the lament is not to depress you, and it's not even to ventilate your negative emotions, although that's part of it, but rather to allow those emotions to turn you to God. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Maybe you've heard this before. Most of us don't look up until we're flat on our back. Let me read to you the words of one commentator who captures the tension that is going on in these laments. He said, all the psalmists are concerned not with distress as such, but with taking it before God, who they know is the judge and at the same time the redeemer, with sovereign power over distress. These psalmists cry to God out of the depths in the confidence and certainty that he has power to lift a person out of the miry bog and to set his feet upon a rock. Hence the laments are really expressions of praise offered to God in the time of his absence. I love that last phrase, praise, or I might substitute the word trust, offered to God in the time of his absence. Let me show you a couple of the second characteristic in a couple of verses that will give you some examples. For instance, in verse 5, we read these words, into your hands I commit my spirit. Deliver me, Lord, my faithful God. Now that's an expression of trust. In fact, if it sounds familiar, it's because they were the last words on Jesus' lips before he died. He said in the midst of that time when he was trying to figure out, my God, why have you forsaken me? What's going on? It's an expression of trust when you can't trace what God is doing. He's saying, God, I can't trace what you're doing, but I'm going to trust you. Into your hands I commit my spirit because you're a faithful God. And then notice verses 14 and 15, and this comes after that litany of lament words. He says, but, and that's a great pivot word where all of a sudden the mood shifts, and he says, I trust in you, Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands. Now, those are two classic expressions of trust that kind of bracket that litany of lament words in the middle. And it reminds us that both lament and trust exist together. They exist together in the Psalms, and they can exist together in our life. 70% of the Psalms, as we said, are laments, And 0% of contemporary Christian music is lament. Now, that should tell us something about the uneasy relationship that we have with suffering. You see an example of this in the way people talk about the COVID crisis. You'll hear them say things like this: well, when things get back to normal, or when things get back to a new normal. In other words, the assumption is that what we're experiencing here is not normal, it's abnormal, and things need to go back to normal. In other words, the underlying assumption is that life is to be kind of easy and problem-free. But that's not the truth. In an earlier devotion, we walked through history and saw how Luther dealt with the Black Plague, and Spurgeon with cholera, and Bonhoeffer with the Nazi regime. I mean, history, and even your history and my history, is filled with ups and downs and trouble. Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation. Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, uses a term, the buffered self. He says that we in the West are so used to using our affluence, our creature comforts, our convenience to buffer ourselves from the pain and the suffering of life. That's why, this COVID crisis seems abnormal to us, because we're able to cushion and buffer ourselves so much of the time. But the laments were written to put you in touch with the reality of suffering and the possibility of trust, even in the midst of suffering.